German fighter pilots thought they had seen everything until July 1943. What came next broke their will to fight before a single shot was fired. The summer of 1943 marked a turning point that most people completely misunderstand about the air war over Europe. Everyone talks about individual dogfights and ace pilots racking up kills, but there was something else happening in the skies that changed everything. Something that made even the most experienced German pilots question whether they could win. And it all came down to numbers that seemed impossible. Friedrich Weber had shot down 17 Allied aircraft by the summer of 1943. He was considered one of the better pilots in his squadron, stationed outside Munich. On the morning of July 24th, he climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109, expecting another day of intercepting small bomber formations, maybe 8 to 12 aircraft, with a few escort fighters. That's what he had been doing for months. But when he reached altitude and looked toward the western horizon, he saw something that made his hands freeze on the controls. The sky was black with aircraft. Not 8 bombers, not 12, not even 50. Hundreds of them, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other, flying in tight box formations that looked like moving fortresses made of metal and glass. And above them, below them, around them, were more fighter escorts than he had ever seen in one place. Weber radioed back to base. His voice, normally calm and professional, cracked as he tried to describe what he was seeing. The controller on the ground thought he was exaggerating. They told him to give an accurate count. He couldn't, there were too many to count. This was the moment when German fighter pilots realized that something fundamental had changed. The Americans had arrived in force, and they weren't coming in small groups anymore. They were coming in waves that blotted out the sun. Let me take you back a bit to understand how we got here. In 1942, American bombers were flying missions over Europe, but the numbers were relatively small. A big raid might involve 30 or 40 bombers. The Luftwaffe could handle that. They had experienced pilots, good aircraft, and well-practiced tactics. They would hit the bomber formations hard, shoot down several aircraft, and force the rest to turn back or scatter. It was dangerous work, but it was manageable. The Americans were learning, though. Every mission, every loss, every after-action report was being studied back in England and in the United States. They were building an industrial system that Germany simply couldn't match. By early 1943, the raids were getting bigger. 50 bombers became 70. 70 became 100. German pilots noticed, but they still felt confident. Their aircraft were good. Their tactics worked. They had the advantage of operating over their own territory, which meant they could refuel and rearm quickly while damaged American bombers had to limp all the way back to England. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was happening in America. American factories were producing flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators at a rate that seemed impossible. A single factory in Willow Run, Michigan, was rolling out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at its peak production. Every single hour, a complete 4-engine heavy bomber was coming off the assembly line. The Germans knew about American industrial capacity in theory. They had intelligence reports, but knowing something as a statistic and seeing it fill your entire field of vision are two completely different things. Hans Philipp, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 kills, described it in his diary. He wrote that before July 1943, combat was about skill, tactics, and courage. After July 1943, it became about survival against impossible odds. He wrote that shooting down one bomber meant nothing because 3 more would take its place the next day. Shooting down 10 bombers still meant nothing. The Americans would send 15 the day after that. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a German pilot. You wake up, fly a mission, and manage to shoot down 2 American bombers. You land, you're exhausted, maybe you're wounded, your aircraft is shot full of holes. You've done your duty. You've succeeded. The next morning, you wake up and there are more American bombers in the sky than there were yesterday. The two you shot down have already been replaced, and the Americans brought extra. This happened day after day after day. On August 17, 1943, the Americans launched what became known as the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. This was a massive dual raid targeting ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and aircraft factories in Regensburg. The Americans sent 376 heavy bombers on this single mission. Let me put that number in perspective. In the entire Battle of Britain in 1940, the largest German raid involved about 400 aircraft total, and that included fighters and bombers. Now the Americans were sending nearly that many bombers alone on a single daylight raid, and they had fighter escorts on top of that. The German defenders threw everything they had at this raid. Every available fighter was scrambled. Pilots flew multiple sorties. Some flew 3 or 4 missions in a single day, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm. They fought with desperate courage and skill. And they did inflict heavy losses. 60 American bombers were shot down that day. 60. That represents 600 American airmen killed or captured. By any normal measure, it was a devastating defeat for the attackers. But here's what broke the spirit of the German pilots. 3 days later, the Americans came back, not with fewer bombers because of their losses. They came back with more. The 60 bombers shot down had already been replaced. The replacement bombers were already in England. The replacement crews were already trained. One German pilot, whose name was lost to history but whose words were recorded by his squadron commander, said it felt like fighting the ocean. You could shoot down waves of bombers all day long, and the ocean would still be there tomorrow, exactly as full as it was before. The mathematics of attrition were brutally simple. Germany was producing about 1,500 single-engine fighters per month at this point in the war. America was producing thousands of 4-engine bombers per month, plus thousands of fighters to escort them, plus training tens of thousands of crew members to fly them. But it wasn't just about the numbers on paper. It was about what those numbers meant in the sky. When a German pilot looked up and saw 300 bombers in a single formation, he was seeing something that represented resources beyond his comprehension. Each of those bombers required 4 engines, which meant 1,200 engines just for the bombers. Each bomber needed 10 to 12 crew members trained in specialized roles. Each bomber needed tons of fuel just to reach Germany and return. Each bomber carried tons of bombs. The logistics behind putting 300 heavy bombers over Germany in a single day represented an industrial and organizational achievement that Germany could not match. And the Americans weren't done scaling up. By the end of 1943, missions with 500 bombers became routine. By 1944, 1,000-bomber raids were not uncommon. On some days, the Americans would launch multiple 1,000-bomber missions to different targets simultaneously. The Luftwaffe was being overwhelmed not primarily by superior technology or tactics, but by sheer material abundance. They were drowning in targets. German fighter tactics had to completely change. Before the mass raids, German fighters could afford to be selective. They could position themselves carefully, choose the best angle of attack, coordinate complex maneuvers. Now, there were so many bombers that tactics became almost irrelevant. You simply dove into the formation and started shooting at whatever was in front of you because there was always something in front of you. This actually decreased German effectiveness. The careful tactical approaches that had worked so well in 1940 and 1941 didn't matter when you were facing an armada. Pilots became more reckless because careful positioning took time, and while you were positioning for one bomber, 50 others were flying past you to their targets. German pilot losses started climbing, not because American bombers became better at defending themselves, though they did improve, but because German pilots were flying more sorties, taking more risks and fighting when they were exhausted. When you fly 3 missions in a day instead of 1, your chance of being killed doesn't triple. It increases even more than that because you're tired, your reactions are slower, your judgment is impaired. The Americans understood this. The strategy wasn't just about destroying German factories with bombs, though that was important. It was about forcing the Luftwaffe to fight so many battles that it would exhaust itself even in victory. Every bomber shot down was a victory for Germany in one sense, but every sortie flown to shoot down that bomber was one step closer to pilot exhaustion, mechanical failure, and eventual defeat. Some of the most experienced German pilots began to crack under the psychological pressure. There's a recorded radio transmission from late 1943. A German flight leader was directing his squadron toward a bomber formation when he suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. After a long silence, he came back on the radio and told his pilots to break off the attack. His squadron commander later asked him why he had given that order. The pilot said he had counted the bombers in front of him and realized that even if every single German fighter got 3 kills, which was impossible, they would only shoot down about 30 aircraft from a formation of 300. The other 270 would reach their target anyway. What was the point? That was the real weapon. Not any individual bombing raid. Not any particular battle. The weapon was hopelessness. The weapon was the certain knowledge that tomorrow would bring more bombers than today, and the day after would bring even more, and there was nothing Germany could do to stop it. German industrial planners tried to respond. They increased fighter production dramatically. By 1944, Germany was actually producing more fighters per month than ever before. But it didn't matter. They couldn't produce pilots fast enough. Training took time, and fuel for training was becoming scarce. The new pilots being sent to operational squadrons had perhaps 30 or 40 hours of flight time. American pilots were arriving with 200 hours or more. The veteran German pilots, the ones who had survived years of combat, were being killed off. As they died, the average skill level of the Luftwaffe declined. This created a death spiral. Less skilled pilots meant more losses. More losses meant even newer, less trained pilots had to be sent up. Those pilots died even faster. Meanwhile, the American formations kept getting larger. By March 1944, the Americans launched a mission with over 700 bombers targeting Berlin in a single day. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. They shot down about 50 bombers, which sounds impressive until you realize that 650 bombers reached Berlin and dropped their bombs exactly where they were supposed to. One German pilot, Georg Peter Eder, wrote after the war that the most demoralizing thing wasn't the combat itself. It was landing after a mission, exhausted and shot up, and hearing the ground crews already talking about the next wave of bombers that was being detected on radar. Sometimes there was barely enough time to refuel before you had to take off again. And when you got to altitude, there would be just as many bombers as before, maybe more. The really insidious part of the American strategy was that it forced the Luftwaffe to commit its fighters. In military terms, the Americans achieved air superiority not just by destroying German planes, but by forcing them to fight battles they couldn't win. German fighters had to intercept the bombers or let German cities be destroyed. There was no third option. This meant American fighter escorts could always find the Luftwaffe fighters because the Luftwaffe had to come to them. It was a trap with no escape. The breaking point came in what was called Big Week in February 1944. The Americans launched a series of massive raids over 6 days, sending thousands of bombers escorted by thousands of fighters. The targets were German aircraft production facilities. The goal was to destroy the factories making the fighters while simultaneously forcing the Luftwaffe to commit its fighters to defend those factories, where American escort fighters would destroy them. It worked perfectly. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost over 300 fighters and, more critically, over 200 pilots. Many of these were experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. The Americans lost about 300 bombers and about 30 fighters, but they replaced all of those losses within 2 weeks. The new bombers and fighters were already crossing the Atlantic. After Big Week, the character of the air war changed completely. The Luftwaffe could still put up resistance, but it was sporadic. Some days they would launch a strong defense. Other days, American bombers would fly deep into Germany and encounter almost no opposition because the Luftwaffe was saving its strength, or because it had been destroyed the day before and was still rebuilding. German pilots who survived the war said that by mid-1944, the psychological battle was already lost. They would take off knowing they were going to see more enemy aircraft than they could possibly engage. The question wasn't whether they would shoot down any bombers. The question was whether they would survive the day. There's a particularly striking account from a Luftwaffe pilot named Heinz Nock. In his diary, he described a mission in March 1944 where he was leading a formation of fighters toward a bomber stream. As he climbed to altitude, he could see the American formation ahead of him. He said it looked like an entire nation had taken flight. The bomber boxes stretched for miles in every direction, and the contrails from hundreds of aircraft had created an artificial cloud layer. He wrote that at that moment, he understood Germany had lost the war. Not because of this specific battle, but because any country that could put this many aircraft in the air at one time had resources that could not be defeated. He flew the mission anyway. He shot down one bomber. His wingman was killed. When he landed and filed his report, he was told that another wave of bombers was approaching and he needed to refuel and take off again. This was the reality of 1944 and 1945 for the Luftwaffe. An endless, grinding, hopeless battle against an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources. The mass bomber formations over Germany represented something more than just a tactical or strategic military operation. They represented industrial and economic power made visible in the sky. Every German pilot who looked up at those formations was seeing the physical manifestation of American industrial might. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Yes, the bombing raids destroyed factories and refineries and rail yards, but they also destroyed hope. They made it clear to everyone, from the pilots in the sky to the civilians on the ground, that Germany was fighting an enemy with resources beyond anything they could match. The German pilots who faced these endless waves did so with courage. Many of them were extraordinarily skilled, but skill can only do so much when you're outnumbered 10-1, or 20-1, or 50-1. Courage can only carry you so far when you know that every bomber you shoot down has already been replaced by 2 more. This is what people often misunderstand about the air war over Europe. It wasn't won primarily through technological superiority or tactical brilliance, though both played a role. It was won through the relentless application of overwhelming material resources. The Americans simply built more aircraft than Germany could destroy, trained more pilots than Germany could kill, and produced more fuel and ammunition than Germany could ever expend. The German pilots were stunned not by any single raid, but by the realization that the raids would never stop, that tomorrow would bring more bombers than today, that their courage and skill, while real and admirable, were ultimately insufficient against an industrial machine that seemed to have no limits. When Friedrich Weber, the pilot from the beginning of this story, finally landed after that July 1943 mission, he was asked by his squadron commander what he had seen. Weber said he had seen the future, and the future was made of aluminum and filled the entire sky. He said they could shoot down every bomber in that formation, and it wouldn't matter because tomorrow there would be more. He was right, and that realization, repeated in the minds of thousands of German pilots over hundreds of missions, did more to win the air war than any single battle ever could. There's another story about the air war that nobody talks about. Watch that next.